Hello, my name is Ryan Green, and welcome to the Last Splash podcast. Today, my guest is Stephanie Lynch. Stephanie is somebody I always go to because she's on the cutting edge every time that I need to gauge what marketing trends and tools are legitimate and which ones are BS. Stephanie is somebody I certainly go to because she's somebody who I know is a futurist. She is an optimist. She wants to see the good in all of these tools. So when she says this isn't game ready, I know it's not because she's somebody that is always forward thinking. Somebody who's been a mentor to me. So I'm really excited to have her on the show. She's been an integral part of the marketing community in St. Louis. She's worked at H&L Partners, Fleshman Hilliard, Build-A-Bear, and the Brighton agency where I first met her. But she's really honed that skill in being on the cutting edge, I would say, in her last two projects, working in crypto and decentralized finance, leading marketing teams for two up-and-coming businesses there. Today, she is the founder and senior partner of Braver Element, a marketing company that specializes in optimizing brand potential. Welcome to the show, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for having me, Ryan. It's a real pleasure and privilege.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate our friendship. You've been very good to me over the years, and you're being good to me again here, appearing with quick notice on my podcast. And I know one of the things that you wanted to talk about was really the intersection of creativity and Web3 and AI and all this really emerging technology that's transforming our industry, but transforming the world. So one question I had was, how do you create an environment that both fosters creativity, but encourages people to take risks and to push boundaries and to be in some uncomfortable situations? How do you foster that environment for yourself, and how have you done that really since the pandemic when you've dove deeply into the Web3 world?
Well, first, I'd like to say that I love creative agencies. I think they're really critical. I think they're so important. I like to think about the creative agency as the emotional R&D or the emotional research and development for brands. And I say that because ultimately the client or on the brand side, typically if they're big enough to hire a reputable, large agency, they have teams of people internally who are de-risking. Their jobs are to limit risk within the brand and the company. Whereas on the agency side, our job is to take risks. It's to take risks with messaging and storytelling and the emotional part of a company so that it's attractive to users and consumers. And those consumers can be anything from farmers to, general consumers buying shoes. It doesn't really matter. Humans have emotions. And I think that what's great about creative agencies is their ability to harness those emotions and tell compelling stories that are meaningful. They bring together the utility and the usefulness of a company and its services and products, and the novelty and creativity, ingenuity of humanity. That's the whole goal of marketing, really, is to put those two things together. I would say, in answer to your question in terms of how to create, a creative environment. Again, I think creative agencies instinctively know how to do this, even if agency leadership didn't come from creative agency, right? Even if they, built a creative agency, they didn't come from necessarily working through the ranks of a creative agency. I think that they understand that because mostly creatives think about time. Creative people understand that they need to maximize and be efficient with time. The time becomes really valuable because it's typically how you measure output. So a creative person can come up with all number of ideas and contexts and strategies and copywriting, but they're typically limited by time. Now, we can think about that later on when we talk more about artificial intelligence and other types of technologies, but humans themselves, they have a finite period of time. You want to express yourself in that time allotment. And so because we're really good at maximizing time, and I guess I should say we, if I'm going to include myself as a creative person, because we're pretty good at maximizing time, we have to think about how to get the most out of that time. And so ultimately, a creative environment in my opinion, has a couple of key aspects. The first thing, it has to have a culture of risk taking, so that people feel comfortable in failing or looking stupid, saying stupid things, especially in brainstorms. The most creative agencies will value that risk taking behavior, along with people who are, do great experiments. So they'll value the failures as well as the people who are actually succeeding. What they cannot tolerate is inaction. They cannot tolerate people who do not optimize time, right? Like, those people need to get off the bus because they're not taking enough risks. They're not putting out output, right? So even bad output is better than no output at all. And you can imagine this yourself, Ryan, in terms of all of the creative work you've done. When you're inside an agency, if you're working with someone who just can't move things forward, like even they get stymied, like they're too afraid to, say something in a meeting, or they spend hours crafting an email. Like they can't survive inside the creative environment because they aren't taking risks. And part of the way you get people to do that is a couple of ways. The first one is that they have to truly be motivated to create. They have to be motivated to make new. Creativity is basically creating new solutions for challenging problems. That's creativity. If you're not interested in that, then the output really doesn't matter. I guess you're not going to be there. And you need to be able to motivate and inspire these people to come to work every day in the creative environment to keep making. And then the other part of that is that, you really have to think about patience and empathy and all of the, sort of the team building aspect of getting people to work together, because collaboration is really key to making really big creative projects.
I would say safety as well, emotional safety, that you can say the stupid thing or the thing that you're not sure is right or that is going to be accepted. I think a big part of that is having that foundation of trust amongst teams, that we can be collaborative and we can really be able to be as creative as we can. We also have to know that what's said in the room stays in the room, and that there are no stupid ideas. In fact, that maybe the stupid ideas are what we need to encourage. I think Liquid Death said that when they were coming up with the name for their brand, they were like, we want to think about the stupidest thing that we could possibly call our product. And that's where they got Liquid Death. Why would you drink a water that was called Liquid Death? And it worked, right? So stupidity may actually be a good place for creativity if you think about it in the right way.
I totally agree with you, and I think that's a really well stated comment, that you have to have this psychological safety and security in order to do your best work. Some people just have the confidence to do that. And other people, it takes a little bit more prying to get that out. I worked with someone once who really struggled with participating in meetings verbally. But this person was really good at making decks, at making documents. And so in meetings, I would ask this person to make slides while we were talking. So the rest of the group would just be talking, and then we would have the scribe who was creating slides and documents. That way we could get to that genius that was inside this person. And I think that the most creative teams are the ones where, even beyond just the creative agency, the most creative teams are the ones where you're really looking for the skills of the person and saying, okay, that person's really good at X. This person's really good at Y. And ignoring what they're bad at. Just ignoring it. Just flat out ignoring it. And then getting them to do more and more of the good stuff. That makes amazing teamwork. And so in that example I gave you, it was I just ignored the fact that this person wasn't verbal. I'm not going to get it out. I tried, right? And so it's I'm just going to ignore that, and let's really utilize what's just amazing about this person. And I think that the key here is that some creative environments, they want everybody to be excellent in the same way because they've seen really good results with that. And managers are case in point. A manager was just, you have a level set expectation. I want you to function in this way. And ultimately, that doesn't make a creative environment. It makes a bunch of sort of excellent robots. It can also make a team of nothing but A players, meaning like your top excellent workers, creatives. And actually, a team of A players usually doesn't output great creative work because they're just competing with each other. And so, if you can get diversity on your team and really champion that diversity, you can get amazing results.
Yeah, if it's the same A work and it's 8 carbon copies of, a lot of times that C work is where that idea could come from, that needs to be put some A gloss on it for it to be something that's disruptive and different, right? And when you talk about creative environments, how has the remote and hybrid and AI functions contributed either positively or negatively to the creative environment? You were kind of talking about creative agencies to start, and I think they feel very comfortable with everybody in the office and being able to go to desks and kind of run the show a little bit there. Is that impulse from creative executives why there's a lot of demanding to come back to the office? And if would those creative executives need to learn some new tricks, I guess, to fostering that kind of foundation of trust or the creative impulse in hybrid and remote environments? How does that interplay happen? And as a futurist, where do you see creativity going as we do more of these hybrid and remote environments?
Well, I've been working remotely for about 3.5 years. What I would say is that I'm going to start with remote. So when you work remotely, the key is documentation, massive documentation. Everything has to live online, and it has to be able to be, accessed immediately, quickly, and added onto. And so just like when you're in a brainstorm and you're adding on to other people's ideas, you need to be adding on to the document, adding on to whatever the format is, and to get to better work, right? I think what was interesting to me about virtual work, I don't believe that it was less work, certainly not in the beginning, because you're learning new skills, especially when it comes to creating massive amounts of documentation and process documentation, especially, that you didn't necessarily need inside the office itself when you were physically there. And then all of a sudden you needed so much more of that. So it created a lot of work to keep that up. But I think at some point you kind of get to this other side where you have enough process documentation, you have the strength and you have the understanding of how to work remotely, and then all of a sudden it does start to free up some pockets of time. What I believe is that what's really important for creative environments is that if you're fully virtual, it's not anymore what are you doing for the work, it's what are you doing in the non-work to stay sharp creatively. So one of the things that people don't like to do is reflect. They don't like to do it. It's a massive amount of work. And especially for some folks, it's like a soft skill, right? It's like when I'm diarying now, I'm like journaling. This is, you know what I'm saying? Like it feels totally antithetical to hard work. Mm-hmm. But actually that period of reflection is where you get the real learning. That's where real learning happens. And so if you divorce reflection, I'm not even talking about postmortems. Like I'm talking about really deep reflection where you take a part of your day and you think about, the work at hand or the work that you've just completed. And then you reflect on how you could improve that work or how it could be changed or how it made you feel or how that could add on to someone else's work. And you really take the time to do that reflection. Ultimately, what I'm saying is that if virtual work frees up some pockets of time, you have two options. You use it personally, right? Like you're doing laundry, you're walking the dog, and or you're using it to really improve the output that you have. You're not sitting back and saying, okay, I'm just going to work less, because ultimately I think that that's not going to set you up for true value in the organization. And then the final part I would say is that I've been talking to a couple of companies that are hybrid. So they have maybe 2 collaboration days a week. And ultimately what I have found is that those companies are virtual companies, but they're trying to function like in-office companies that just have some virtual days. And actually, it's the flip flop. They are virtual companies, they just happen to get together 2 times a week. And those companies, it's really challenging because I don't think they have enough of the process down for being a virtual company. And so then they're having kind of hiccups in terms of training and handing off and how to think about that because they're continually trying to function like an in-office company because setting up the virtual environment takes a lot of work. It does. It really takes a lot of work. So I think that the cautionary tale isn't that you shouldn't be a hybrid company. It is that I truly believe that every company is a virtual company now and that you can be in the office 5 days a week. That's fine. You're still a virtual company. And part of that is just because of the nature of other, clients, if they're hybrid, it's the nature of greater collaboration. It's the proliferation of all of these collaborative tools. It's a mindset of how we want to have more flexibility and freedom. And so, again, it isn't to say that I'm against being together personally. I love people. You know that, Ryan. I love being
Yeah.
with people. But I think it's more of a mindset to say, okay, we are a virtual company and we're going to have all the process and the documentation for that so that we can utilize the tools, the collaborative tools, and the other types of technology that's available to their greatest extent. And then we're also going to be in the office together every once in a while.
Yeah, I think about 95% of companies have some virtual aspect to them. Maybe a laundromat doesn't, right? Like, I don't know if they need a social media voice to talk about what's happening at the laundromat, right? But almost everybody else is. Even a coffee shop probably has some voice in Web 2, right? And I agree with you, any firm that has any type of multiple offices or remote work, and this certainly started before the pandemic, right? This was not a new function, does need to put the infrastructure together to make virtual work reliable and potentially saving them a lot of time and being able to access talent anywhere.
Right.
I think if you go to creative agencies who, if they're on a legacy model with all full-time employees, all for the most part coming to the office at least 3 days a week and living within metro areas that you could drive to, they're missing an amazing amount of opportunities by not leaning into maybe near and offshore work, being able to have more flexibility with contractors. I bet a lot of those firms are ones that are behind the eight ball on AI as well, because they're used to having control when they
Right.
can go into the person's office and get a quick coffee and have catch-ups with them, right? And a lot of this is going to be making sure that everybody in the firm, but especially executives, are comfortable being uncomfortable and being able to learn new ways of producing creative results in a fragmented environment.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting that you were talking about, being prepared for AI and coming into the office and building a relationship. And I was thinking to myself that going back to what we were talking about earlier around psychological safety, that part of the issue around these virtual environments and virtual work is the loss of relationship. And I do think that there is an erosion of relationship when you work
Oh, yeah.
in a virtual environment, right? And so you have to be really protective and proactive about building relationship. In the office, especially when we go back to like talking in a brainstorm, if you know people, you're more likely to take risks because you have the permission to fail. But when you don't know someone at all, sometimes I think it's actually more challenging. I guess for other people, they just don't care, right? But I think that it becomes more challenging when you don't really know those people, especially if you're brainstorming in a Slack channel and there's, 25 people in that Slack channel. I think it becomes a little bit more challenging. But I think that there are ways to foster relationship within, the virtual environment. I think it's most important in a creative, if you want to have great creativity, is to say that sometimes virtual workers, they don't want relationship. That's why they're working virtual, right? Like they don't want an in-office
Yeah.
job. They just want to clock in, clock out. And I would say that's fine, but not in a creative environment. Like if you're going to work for a creative company, you must relate. And I think as a manager managing teams, you have to force those relationships in the sense of we don't have to be family, right? We're not best friends necessarily, but we really need to know each other. And that means taking the time to have water cooler chats. It means taking the time to ask people and have assessments around how are you feeling today on a scale from 1 to 5. Like just very simple tricks that you could use to get people talking about themselves, about their worlds. You need to know if they have children and how they interact on the weekend and what they ate for breakfast, all the kinds of things that you would talk about inside an office. Those things become maybe even more important when you work virtually, especially if you don't even live in the same state or the same country.
Yeah, if you've never met your teammates, but there's situations where I haven't met people for years and we still have a very close, trustworthy, productive, creative relationship. So it's certainly possible. It's just coming in with the right ethos with it and embracing each type of communication channel, right? Embrace getting on the plane and going and visit and having a chance to visit people in person, even if they're across the country. Embrace the Slack channels and the emojis and the text messages of being able to still quickly have those connections. And especially creative types or people in media have to be able to embrace a variety of different ways of working and show flexibility and not have their work be too boxed. It's impossible now. It's too three-dimensional, especially when you kind of think about the relationship between technology and creativity now. I'll send you this podcast or put it in the show notes here, but I was really inspired by conversation between Rick Rubin and Paula Shire, who is a partner at the Pentagram design firm. And, she talked about what the definition of graphic design is. She's like, I've been doing graphic design for 50 years. I was putting together album covers in the 60s, right? That she would consider graphic design, right? And she was using technology to be able to mass produce designs that would go on billboards or on record covers, all the way through covers of books to whatever the digital output's going to look like. So that evolution of the convergence of technology and creative has been happening for a long time, but certainly is taking a step forward now. How do you look at the relationship between technology and creativity throughout your career, and where do you see it going in the next 5 years?
Well, I like to think about technology as, just it's human innovation. Humans were created to innovate. We are curious all the way back to the beginning of time. And sometimes there's dangers in that curiosity and sometimes there isn't, right? I think that the key is that, to me, technology is just another creative tool. It's like a paintbrush. It just, sometimes it's programmable and it has other use cases. It's scalable, right? The paintbrush isn't scalable per se. I think that's why I've always been really attracted and almost addicted to technology, even though I'm not a developer, right? I'm not a coder. I don't make software, but I live in that world. Like it's totally fascinating to me. I'm totally enamored by it. And I think it's why I started many years ago in social media. So in 2010, I started working in social marketing, ultimately because I was so fascinated by the democratization of screens. At the time, and I don't know that a lot of people would think about it in this way, but at the time, Twitter and Facebook were decentralization at its finest. Before it became, advertising and pay to play, it was just a random person with, no money could have a giant channel and have that, that soapbox that they could speak from. Egyptian Spring was totally fascinating. I watched that on Twitter, and that just really excited me. It made me want to stay connected. And over time, social media sort of lost a little bit of luster in the sense of it's not the same kind of technology. It's far more centralized. I guess you could say that it has corrupted itself in the game to capitalize. But I think that
The
the
enshittification of the internet, I think, is what you're
right.
referring to,
Yes.
basically. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely, Ryan. But there are other technologies along the way that I found super fascinating. Blockchain is one of them, Web3, which you mentioned earlier. So the last 3.5 years, I've primarily worked in blockchain and some AI companies, helping them with their marketing because I think that the future is definitely on chain. I don't think that the future that we thought in, say, 2021 is going to materialize, but I do think that the connection between artificial intelligence and blockchain is here, and that there are a load of people who are really working hard to bring those two technologies together. And the reason why is because there's a lot of fear around artificial intelligence, copywriting, expertise. Where does the content come from? Where does where does the language come from? Where is this expertise coming from? Blockchain can secure identity. Of course, it also has programmable money features so that you can trade and exchange for that data, for that language. And so for those reasons, I think that blockchain and AI are, just a marriage. There's a lot of different aspects of the blockchain world, different niches that are popping up right now. Things like decentralized science, which is really fascinating in terms of the way scientists are trying to collaborate and create basically new drugs, new technologies, cures for diseases. And they're utilizing blockchain and other types of technologies to be able to share resources and to decentralize that science. I think that there's other niches like DePIN, which is decentralized public infrastructure. The best way to describe this, I think, is there's a project called eLoop, which is part of Peak. Peak is a blockchain. That was a blockchain that I've worked on in the past from a marketing perspective. And eLoop is sort of like, it's like you can rent a car, okay? You rent the car, and then the payment is tokenized, so you're paying with crypto. But the benefit is that as more and more people ride and take rides on eLoop, and as the company becomes more profitable, then your tokens that you're investing matter more. And so it becomes like basically a decentralized loop. It's sort of like saying, what if every time you took an Uber, you paid $1, but then that dollar was actually a share of the company? And as the
Yeah.
company grew, you got returns. That's what eLoop can do for you. And so I think that there's a lot of companies that are really experimenting creatively and trying to see if we can come up with new ways to build services, to profit off of those services, and to share those rewards. I think that's really interesting. Now, I do tell a cautionary tale in the sense of, eventually hegemony rules, right? Like eventually our better angels kind of lose in some respects, because if you think about what happened with social media, things become centralized. I think
There
capital
becomes a difference in the motivations of the owners and the users
right.
that at first are very blended, but get wedged when there's a profit margin put to it. So capitalism can be a force for good, but can drive a wedge
Absolutely.
in between, depending on how it's used, right? And capitalism still functions in decentralized finance. What you're saying is just decentralized communities.
Right.
That function's gonna, comes into play at some point.
It's not to say that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It is to say that economies matter, and oftentimes economies can erode what was originally planned for a technology. And that sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes it's a bad thing. It's less about pointing fingers and telling doomsday stories and more about how can we use the technology for good now? Like what's
Mm-hmm.
good about it now? And so I think that that's going to be critical when we think about how to utilize AI and how that will disrupt and transform not just economies, but how we live and work.
So how do you think AI is going to disrupt economies and how we live and work?
I think I'll speak from a marketing perspective, right? Because
That would be great. Yeah.
I'm not a developer, and I'm not Ethan Mollick, who's a very famous researcher in AI and computer science. As a marketer, it's really, first of all, I think it's really important for us to experiment with LLMs like ChatGPT and Claude. I think that's really important because our clients are going to be using that technology at a far different scale, I think, than most of the creative agencies are going to be using it, because it's going to disrupt, everything from like supply chain to procurement, certainly finance. I think it will disrupt those areas, product development. And inside the agency right now, what people are really using it for is just copywriting, right? Maybe some frameworks or strategy. But I think
Maybe some analytics or data science
sure,
type stuff too, a little bit.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Summarizing data, summarizing meetings, getting outputs from that. I think that it's pretty menial tasks, really, right?
Yes.
Like it's not that disruptive right now. Although I do think it's disruptive to freelancers. So, there's been some new research that's come out recently that freelance work has decreased because of AI.
Right when I started freelancing, it was a perfect timing for that. Thank you, world.
It's funny, Ryan. I think that the way it's going to disrupt for marketers is that it does create greater efficiency, right? So like right now, if you're working in marketing, especially in an agency, and you're not using AI right now to record every meeting and to transcribe those meetings and to gain insights from those meetings and share those insights and come up with ways to instill them in every project, I think that you need to take a look at just doing that. Like that's just table stakes to start recording meetings and getting people used to the concept of having their meetings recorded. Second part of that is that over time, I think that efficiency and how we deliver, how we create the work and how we deliver the work will free up pockets of time within the agency. That's part of the benefit of artificial intelligence, is that it does things very fast. And if we go back to the beginning of this conversation, creativity, as the way I was talking about it inside the agency, maximizing time is really critical so that you can get more value out of what's in here. I think that fundamentally agencies are going to have to think about layering on additional value add, right? That just being able to generate a brand platform, for example, or articles or copywriting, it's not going to be enough. In the sense of, yes, AI will help you do that. And then because you've done that and you've done it faster, here's a caveat. I don't think that agencies should be laying people off, right? Like oh, well, now I can do this with 4 people, right? That I think is very self-limiting. It's more about, hey, here's my team. We have AI. I have some expectations for how to, create greater efficiency, de-risk the agency when it comes to getting certain things done very quickly and factually accurate. At the same time, now we've freed up, even if we've just freed up 1 hour a day for every individual within your team or your organization, what are they doing with that time? Goes back to, before when I was talking about reflection and utilizing that time. If your creatives are freeing up pockets of time and using that time to do nothing, well, that's not creating value for them really, and it's not creating value for the organization. And so now you need to think about what are the ways that we're going to be utilizing that time to upskill everyone. So let's say you have a team of 5 people, their job is to make articles. So all of a sudden they've got AI on board, and maybe let's say they're freeing up 2 hours of time a day because they're using artificial intelligence. Well, now what can you think about adding on to those projects? And how can you get them to really think creatively? What kinds of behaviors and what kinds of tasks do they need to be doing inside the organization to be very creative? And then what can they be building with no code or low coding to then create extra value on top of that? And so to me, it's less about saying, oh, every marketer needs to be a coder. It's more about saying, no, every marketer needs to maximize their creative output and be able to add value, not just some of the time, all the time. Because the AI should be able to help them do that, frankly.
Yeah, I think when you look at the structure of agencies, I agree with you. They're laying off too many people. and not thinking about restructuring the agency for this new modern future. And I've thought a lot about this, had many conversations with agency folks. It's the majority of my network, and everybody's struggling with how to frame that and how to think about it. For me, the thing that I can't figure out is what the role of the account person is. In some respects, I think this may make them a lot more valuable, and in other respects, I could see there being a lot of overlap between like just the AI note function on meetings, right? And being able to have that summary very quickly. There's no need for the scribe anymore. I totally did not prepare you for this question, but it's something that I get, that's a 50-50 battle in each conversation that I have about this. Is the role of the account person more or less valuable in the age of AI?
I think both. But let me tell you both sides of the story. If they're less valuable, what happens is that then you shrink your agency, right? You start to shrink your agency so that you can maximize profitability. Mm-hmm. Over time, you will lose your agency. So if that, it can be both, right? But if you go that road, I think eventually you will literally, within 30 years, your agency will no longer exist. If you continue to do the same thing with less.
30 years.
10?
Maybe 3 years, but yeah, I don't.
3. I mean, I'm really trying to future forecast because I can't see the future, right? So, I mean, maybe in 3 years. I think in Missouri, since we are in St. Louis, we're somewhat protected. If you're on the coast, absolutely. You'll lose your organization probably within 10 years. Before you retire, it will be gone and you won't be able to sell it because the value will be gone. Because you're desperately trying to just maximize profitability with less. I think that if you make the account person one of the most valuable people in the organization, because they truly are now, a really good account person is your client services manager. And so that person is usually the front person to sell in more incremental work, to make sure that the team is maximizing time and profitability. So they're tracking budgets. I mean, they're really, really critical to managing the trains, managing the team within an organization to give the client what the client expects. If you make this person even more critical, because to your point, well, maybe we don't need some of their skills anymore in terms of, I don't know, taking meeting notes and things like that, which is really more of like your junior account person. But I think that an account manager needs to be a better manager of people and skills. And so some account managers they're good, right? Some aren't, because they're just really good with the client. And so therefore they really haven't learned or flexed skills in terms of actually managing the team. They're just so good with the client that people just ignore the fact that they're actually not very good at managing people. But I think that in the future, this person is going to have to absolutely maximize the creativity and the added value of what every member brings to the team. And so they're going to have to come up with what people are doing in this flex time. Okay, since you've got 2 hours a day, what are we doing with that time? A bad account manager is just like, I don't know, I'm busy, right? A good one is going to set up the actual behaviors and the construct of how we get to better creative output, and then helps to imagine and envision what that output could be. I think that everyone within the organization is creative, otherwise they wouldn't be working there. I think that we do a disservice by saying this is the creative team and this is the account team and this is the finance team, like whatever. I think that's ridiculous. Actually, it actually makes me irritated and frustrated. It's ridiculous. Why would we segment one team and say, you're not creative, I don't even want you to think that way?
I hate that too. The word creativity, because I've always been at a media agency, and I've said to my employees how many times, you are creative. I know we're not creating ads, we're placing them, but we have to think creatively. Everybody is creative. We need to separate the noun from the verb. You are creative, or the noun from the adjective, or whatever it is. Haven't had enough coffee this morning, but
I understand what you meant.
I have a speed round of questions here, but I want to ask one more. Do you have a list of, or a couple tools that you would recommend that you use as you're looking at hybrid and remote work for creatives, or looking at some of the variety of AI tools? Are there things like Notion or Slack that you go to make sure that you're having great communication? I know those are pretty well used, but is there a toolbox of tools that you would recommend?
So I test a lot of stuff, right? Like I'm always testing, applications. I typically use Otter for recording meetings and transcribe. I know you use Firefly. We've talked about this before. I find that to be helpful. I think it's only helpful if you use it. So if you record the meeting and you have the transcription and the insights and you don't ever read it or don't do anything with it, it's kind of self-limiting. But I also think that just having that historical record is nice to have. I typically use the 3 frontier language models against each other. So I use Gemini Pro, I use Claude Pro, and I also have utilized the non-pro version of Claude, and then ChatGPT Pro. And I think that what I like to do is come up, like ask it questions and then get a framework and then ask the other two to give feedback on that original output. That's really interesting to kind of like gamify them. Poe is a really interesting software platform where you can access mini LLMs within the system. And that kind of makes it a little easier to, ping pong concepts back and forth. Primarily, I never use final output as my final deliverable. Let me back up and say I'm a strategist. So most of the work that I do is strategy. There's times when I will output like a press release and things like that. I will use AI to help with that. But for the strategy, it's more like having like a brainstorming buddy that's not really that good. And depending on the prompt and the context that you give it. I have one particular chat session within one of the LLMs that I have so much context, and it's so good at it has like so many characters now that I can get really interesting stuff out of it. It's very specific to an output that I'm looking for. And so that's like one of my favorite chats that I'll enter into because I know I'm going to get something good from it. But for the most part, I like to play them against each other. For my own strategy work, I found that nothing that it gives me is going to be final output. There's one other platform that I really encourage people to try out, and that's Perplexity. I think most people have heard of it or have used it at this point, but it's AI search, and it has a couple of really interesting features, including these collaboration tools where you can make collections and you can share them with teammates, and they can add to it, which I find to be really helpful. And then also it will create AI generated articles, almost like blog articles about a topic. And that's really interesting, includes images and everything. I highly recommend people experiment with that. I would say that an offshoot of marketing, of applications I think are really interesting, are AI generated gaming. So I realize this doesn't have necessarily anything to do directly with marketing, right? Like with making social copy or advertisements or digital analytics. But I find these tools to be really fascinating. The first one is Rosebud AI that I've come across, and the other one's called Astrocade AI. I think those are really, really interesting. I'd like to see what happens in the next 6 months to a year with those, in the sense of imagine being able to create a game that's at least as fully featured as Minecraft or Roblox, just with prompts. I think the concept here is like, imagine what that could mean for upskilling and training. Imagine what that could do for education. Imagine how you could be able to create games and things for different brands. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to consider it, even in terms of like things like gamifying your internal resources, like making a game of it. Even thinking like, how can I make a game around cooking and shopping? And what could that look like if I gave it all this context, personal context? I think there's just like a lot of ways that you can think about using that I think is really interesting. So I'm fascinated by those particular tools because they're pretty low code and they're text based, and that's pretty cool.
So talk about a couple tools. I think you're definitely right about the meeting note AIs. You need to go back into it. And I like it for two reasons. One, well, three reasons. Like keeping that historical record, I can go back 3 weeks to a meeting and see what, verify what was actually said, not just base it on my memory. That's great. It's very searchable. I also like that it shows the percentage of time that somebody is talking. For expressives like myself that have been trying very hard to listen better, I can go back and see my failures very clearly when 2/3 of the pie chart is me, and I can see my words per minute just increasing, and that's been helpful for people who are trying to be better active listeners. I also think it's a slightly underrated skill to go back and listen to yourself. I know everybody hates the sound of their own voice, but it's helpful for anybody who's pitching or presenting or just having to talk to clients. Really, I just think anybody to go back and listen to yourself. It's uncomfortable at first, but it's very helpful to get some context. And again, for me, who's overly indulgent in talking and hearing my own voice, it grates me to hear me talking in circles and circles, and I just want to get to what they had to say. And realizing how much I've owned the microphone has, I think, helped me as I'm owning the microphone right now, talking to you about it. I think there's a lot of good self-reflection time that you can do with the recordings. If you really do care about and consider yourself a marketing professional, you probably should go listen to yourself talk, and it's all available at the tip of your fingertips now.
I totally agree with you. I think it goes back to that reflection, right? I like to think about the creative process as like a multi-step process. The first is imagine, which I think is pretty self-explanatory, envisioning new. Then there's reframe, which is really looking at something from a different perspective. And there are ways to think about, like, again, some people are just unconsciously able to do that, but there are exercises that you can do, and there are things that you can do to train your mind to think more from a reframing perspective. But you have to reframe in order then to experiment. So that's the third step, is you're experimenting and trying things out, whether it's wordplay, just trying things out from a copy or a strategy perspective, or you're experimenting with data, which you do all day long when it comes to, making the science experiments of advertising. And then you've got apply. So you take the imagine, the reframe, and the experiment, and you apply that to the work. And then you have reflection. And the reflection part is what we talked about earlier, people don't want to do. But it really, you're right. I 100% agree with you that listening to yourself is so uncomfortable. And yet that reflection is where we really learn and we make breakthroughs.
You also brought up perplexity. There's a hit piece on Wired right now called "Perplexity is a Bullshit Machine," saying that it makes things up out of thin air and is scraping Forbes, who I'm shocked Forbes wants to protect their intellectual property, because that's totally a pay-to-play site, and everybody who's an expert on there is paying Forbes $1,000 a month to have their subscription. So it's funny that they're...
That's funny, right?
They're the ones saying this. I've not read this full article, but I will send it to you, and I will link it in the show notes for anybody who's interested. The evaluation of the accuracy of the AI tools is also really interesting, just to see the media around it and to see a lot of cultural gatekeepers certainly trying to PR their influence over these things. So I wouldn't take this Wired article directly. It's I think you really have to think about a variety of things, and it's such a fast-moving state. Yeah, maybe Perplexity is a bullshit machine today, and it has hallucinations like GPT-3 did, and then version 5 ends up being great. So even though this is 5 days old, maybe it's already dated for all that we know.
Well, I would say that what's great about Perplexity is that it gives you the sources. So then you can check and see if the data is correct or if it's hallucinating. It's not always really good at secondary questions. So you ask it a question, it gives you an output, it includes the sources, and then you'll ask a contextual question based on that feedback, and it kind of loses the trail, right? Like, it's not always very good at that, but I think it's pretty helpful. It will, it searches pretty deeply, it answers your questions directly, And then it gives you the sources so you can follow up. It'll look through academic publications, which are super helpful. I would give it a second look. I think that search as a whole is going to change, largely because of perplexity.
Oh yeah, and from a marketer standpoint, they have to prepare for that. Well, one, search has already changed quite a bit. I think you saw some big price increases over the pandemic, and look, Google is going to do everything they can to get the same amount of money out of fewer searches that show ads. So the only way to do that is to charge more. It's coming, right? And that does affect a number of small business and D2C type brands that have based most of their customer acquisition on search and social to some degree, that are going to have to pay the piper and are going to have to think of a creative way to change, not because of AI directly, but because of the business model of tech companies that are potentially upended by AI's presence.
Right. I totally agree. I mean, I was going to say two things. The first one is that I think there are some ethical considerations when we think about ads being served up from LLM chats. I mean, that's coming. I think that's, I think there are some ethical considerations. I think some people are not going to understand that those are advertisements. I also was going to say that I do have an Excel spreadsheet. Well, it's not Excel, it's a Sheets. I have a Sheets spreadsheet of tools. I don't know, there's probably like 50, 60 tools in there. I'm happy to share it with you, Ryan. And if you want to put it in the show notes, you can. It's a very simple database of tools that I've looked at, played with, that I think are interesting. A little bit from a marketing perspective, some just from a human perspective. It's a list that I put together for friends and family. So I'm happy to share it.
Well, hopefully you consider me friends and family
Yes.
to some degree too, and all of our audience. So
I'm happy to share it.
what are some of the biggest changes you expect to see in the marketing industry over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I definitely think it goes back to what we talked about before around adding additional value. But I also think that we're going to see a lot of change in avatars. HeyGen just received another round of funding. So HeyGen is a avatar video enabled AI powered software platform. If you're not familiar with it, it's gotten a lot of buzz. There are other platforms, there are other competitors, but it just seems to get a lot of love. I guess largely it's got good marketing, right? I think that we're going to see some massive shifts in how we think about avatars. I read a recent Squarespace study that 60%, I believe it was 60% of Gen Z believe that their online identity is more important to them than how they present themselves in person, which I find fascinating.
Fascinating is one word. Crazy is another one, maybe.
Well, I read another report that Gen Z also, I think it was a Sprout social report. I think it was like 46% of Gen Zers, they would be more interested in a brand that used an AI avatar. And
it kind of goes to my next question. What role do you think virtual and augmented reality will play for the future of marketing and branding?
so this book, Virtual Society, I recommend anybody picking it up, giving it a skim. It's really interesting. It was written by Herman Narula. He is the CEO and the founder of a company called Improbable. They were a former client. The key here, the reason why I'm bringing it up, is that he goes into some detail towards the end of the book about how in 100 years from now we could be implanted and we'll live our lives in virtual reality so that we can, the metaverse, so that we can choose which worlds we want to live in. I don't know if that's true. I do think that there's a lot of really interesting implications of the book. I think people should read it. It's fascinating, whether you agree with him or not. I think that in the future of marketing, we really need to be thinking about these virtual worlds and spaces and how we access them, how we utilize them, and what they represent in our real lives. I think that goes back to the stats that I was saying around Gen Z. They construct their worlds and their lives very differently from older generations.
What are some of the most interesting or unexpected applications of AI or blockchain that you've came across?
Unfortunately, blockchain and the reputation around blockchain really focused on cryptocurrency and decentralized finance. And ultimately what people learned was that cryptocurrency is a casino. And that actually was a huge detriment to the entire industry because there are way more implications for how to utilize blockchain. And so I think that those things beyond decentralized finance are what are really, really interesting to me. I think we've got to get past the casino and the entertainment aspect. There are really interesting, like real world implications for how we interact with one another, how we share data that I think are way more interesting than the casino.
The casino perception's chipping away, I think, with some acceptance of cryptocurrency by the FCC and some of the things that have happened recently. At least that part of it will. But yeah, people think of blockchain as the train that drives crypto exchanges and not the myriad of other things. So you've given me a lot of knowledge on that, probably more than anybody else does. So maybe there's an opportunity for some content for you because you've done such a good job for me personally, which I always appreciate. What advice would you give to, I would say, two groups, people just entering the marketing industry and maybe those like the 55 plus that still have 10 years of work but still need to find a way to evolve into AI? When they don't know where to start or how to think about upskilling, what advice do you give those groups?
I think they need to find each other. Like, if you're 55 plus and you're lost, but you feel like you need to learn about AI, and if you're, fresh out of college and you're not sure how to, gain ground in the marketplace, those two groups need to find each other. They don't need to ignore each other. They need to team up. There's an amazing amount of power that can come from those two disparate generations combining forces. I think that young people understand this and they're constantly looking for mentorship. I don't know if every expert on that other side is looking for a mentee. I think that if you're an expert, you need to be looking for a mentee at all times. You need to be coming together, and that it's not just, hey, I'm going to put the onus on the young person to find me. You need to be looking for those people too.
I think the expert feels like it's an act of charity to take a mentee on, and I think they need to look at a second level and realize how much they can learn and how much more powerful they can be with fresh new ideas and excitement and all of that.
I agree.
It's not just a charity, but
well, let me just say, I think that outlook is so ridiculous, really.
It is.
It makes me laugh, actually, that you're right. I agree with you that the mentor tends to think like that it's an act of charity, but the mentor is going to gain so much because if we go back to reflection, the mentee is going to force the mentor to reflect. You will gain more learning out of helping someone else than not. This summer, I'm trying to work with a group of high school interns. That's a whole other conversation. And I'm really excited about it. I've developed an internship program just for these high school kids because I want to see what I can get out of it. I think it's really important. I'm doing what I'm preaching in the sense of I think it's really important to stay connected to people who are learning because they are going to teach you unimaginable things that you can't predict. I think it's typically a surprise, but they will teach you things that you need to know.
I agree the onus should be on the expert to that. It's a lot easier probably for you since your son's in high school and you kind of been able to see that and may have some natural connections, but for a number of reasons, maybe even just for better communication amongst things that are happening in society and politics too, we need to reach out to a lot of different people that look different than us, not just by age, but also by location. Urban and rural need to talk to each other more. And when those collisions happen, there's a lot of magic there. It certainly, I think, would be helpful so the hey boomer crap can get quieted from what some of the kids say, because they need to have better connections with people that are older too. So
agreed.
I love it. Well, thank you, Stephanie. We're certainly past time. We could talk. We talk for hours and hours when we get together. So this is actually a pretty short conversation. I will edit. I will hit the stop button and edit right now. So thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for listening to the Last Splash podcast.
Thanks, Ryan.
Have a great day.
Bye. Bye.